Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's message. I'm Eric, the lead pastor of South Mountain Community Church. Thank you for taking just a bit of your time to be with us today. We exist for one reason, and that's to help as many people as possible take their next step towards becoming fully devoted and fully delighted followers of Jesus Christ. And I know that for so many people, church and even religion can be messy and oh so complicated, but it doesn't have to be that way. Here you can belong before you believe. So our hope is that your first visit with us is enjoyable, meaningful, and unlike the church experiences of your past. We also think that the best way to experience delight is with others in person. So SMCC is about more than just a Sunday sermon. We have 5 locations for you to choose from where you can connect with people in authentic community. We want every message you hear to engage your head, your heart, and your hands for a life of full delight. So with all of that in mind, enjoy today's message. Well, what a morning we've had together so far. If you're coming in a little bit late, I'm Eric, get to serve as one of the pastors on the team here, and it's just great to see so many of you here on Super Bowl Sunday. And I'm just curious what type of fans we have in the room. So raise your hand, cheer a little bit if you're rooting for the 49ers. 49ers fans. Wow, all right, yeah. Wow, that was amazing. Well done. Okay, also raise your hand a little cheer if you're cheering for Taylor Swift's boyfriend's team. Okay. What are they called? I don't even know. Oh, Kansas City, okay. Now, I'm really glad you're here. I'm going to a party later this afternoon. I hope you have a great time watching the game. Now, last week, I read a short story called Button, Button, and I want to share that short story with you as we begin our conversation, our message together. The story was written in the 1970s, and it's about a married couple named Arthur and Norma. Okay, Arthur and Norma in this short story are presented with a proposition by a stranger that knocks on the door. And so the stranger knocks on the door, and he's carrying with him a small little box. And inside of the box, there is a button, hence the title Button, Button. And the proposition is this, that they are faced with. You can open the box, use the key, uncover the button, and press it. And if you do, you will receive a large sum of money. Millions upon millions of dollars. But if you push the button, someone that you do not know will die. That's the proposition in the short story, Button, Button. Okay, that's it. It's that simple. Push the button, receive millions. Push the button, someone that you don't know will die, but someone, a real person, nonetheless. So, what would you do? Anybody in the room want to admit they'd push the button? You're like, no, not me. Didn't think so. Yeah, what would you do? I mean, this story is designed to get us wrestling with some themes that are connected to the realities of life. So as you can imagine, Arthur and Norma begin to discuss this. They discuss it at dinner, they discuss it the next day, and there's tension building in the marriage because she's like, it doesn't make me a murderer. I don't know them at all. Someone that I'll never meet, someone that I'll never see. What difference does it make? We need a car, we need a cottage, we want to have another kid. We need the money. And Arthur's like, what is wrong with you, you know? So the short story continues. And Arthur the next day goes to work, and Norma digs out the button. And while no one is around, she presses it. And as she presses it, nothing happens. And she thinks to herself, that stranger who presented this to me, this is just ridiculous. But that evening, the phone rings. And she answers it. And she is talking with someone from the local hospital. She received the money. But the person who died was none other than Arthur. And she goes into grief. She enters into sadness. She calls up the stranger and says, you said it would be someone that I do not know. And the stranger says, do you think you actually knew your husband? And the story ends like that. I read it to my kids last night, and they are still wrestling with the themes in this story. this story, it introduces us to some ideas in life about being known, ideas about being in relationship. This idea that sometimes the person that you think you might know the best maybe is someone you don't know very well at all. Perhaps they could be an utter stranger. And this kind of reminds us of a theme that I think we've all felt in life, a desire that we all have. And if you're taking notes on the bulletin you received when you walked in, you could write this down. We all desire to be known. We all desire to be known. I mean, we would not want to be Arthur in that story because we desire to be known. We do not want to be like Norma in that story because we desire to know and to be known. And yet this story just draws out this tension and really can expose this fear that we have. The fear being this: if someone really knew me though, would they still love me? Would they still respect me? Would they still like me? I mean, you guys see a version of me for 30 minutes on a Sunday. You know, they wheel me out the back and here I am and they wheel me back, you know? But there's some people that really do know me. And the process in life that we're in with people who love us and care about us in community is, can I show you these things, these dark things, these things maybe I don't want people to know, these things I've been hiding for the majority of my life perhaps. If you knew them, would you still accept me? Would they still respect me? Would they still like me? Would they still love me? And this is what makes love incredibly risky, doesn't it? And this is what makes shame incredibly painful, doesn't it? Because shame is someone knowing those parts, seeing those parts, having come face to face with those aspects of your life that you maybe want to hide, and instead of embracing you with them, they walk away from you because of them. And that hurts so badly. So with all this in mind, I want to ask you a question. Who knows you? Who knows you? This is a pretty risky question because love is a risky thing. And being exposed can be oh so scary. But here's what's at stake. And this is the tension we're living in today. This is the tension. Here's what's at stake. If no one fully knows us, then no one can fully love us. And we want to be fully loved, don't we? In fact, this is my definition of intimacy. Intimacy is being fully known and fully loved. It's bigger than a romantic thing. In fact, this can happen in relationships that aren't romantic, being fully known and fully loved. That is an intimate type of relationship. And here's what I need you to know, and then I'll show you this from the Bible. God fully knows you. He fully sees you, which could be incredibly scary and incredibly frightening, especially if you were raised thinking that he was going to get you for it. But he fully knows you, and he fully loves you. And now, that is our invitation to walk in a close, intimate relationship with God. So today we're beginning a brand new 7-week series. It's going to take us all the way to Good Friday and all the way to Easter. And this series is called Contours. Contours is the French word for outline. In a contour drawing, if you're an art major, you already know this, but a contour drawing works with contrasts. It works with simple shapes to contrast that which is the shape to that which is not the shape. Contrast drawings by nature are very simple. They're rather simplistic. You could even say crude, but this isn't out of laziness. This is by design to help us see that which is from that which isn't. And in much the same way, John, who wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, also the Gospel of John, in the first century is drawing a very simple contour drawing that is so powerful, contrasting what life with God is actually like, contrasting a whole bunch of themes. And so for the next few weeks, 7 weeks, we're gonna study 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John to look at how John is sketching out the outline of salvation. And salvation is the key idea to these letters that John wrote in the first century to young churches, small churches in the region of Asia Minor, his close friends that he loves deeply. He's writing to them to help them see the outline, the contour of what salvation is, in contrast to all the things they're being taught about salvation which are untrue. And I'll take you into all that context in just a little bit. So the key idea for John is this right here. We're gonna come back to this over and over again. Salvation, it's intimacy with God. Now, there's some other things we could say about what it means to be saved and how to step across the line of salvation, but John is going to pick it up, not in the justification phase, I'll explain that in a little bit. He's gonna pick it up in the sanctification phase and explain what ongoing salvation looks like, and he describes it as intimacy with God, or fellowship. We're gonna see that word used 4 times in the first chapter alone. He's talking about intimacy with God, how to live fully known and fully loved by God. And so to do that, he's gonna draw some stark contrasts, and we're gonna see some of them today. And these contrasts are so severe at times, we think, how does this fit into the other things that I know about Christianity or about the gospel? Or how does John align with Paul? How does 1 John align with Romans, another book in the Bible? And I'm gonna explore all of that with you. We're gonna have a great time doing it. So today we're gonna see a contrast between light and dark. We're gonna see a contrast between truth and lies. And ultimately, we're gonna see a contrast between fellowship with God and a lack of it. Now, by doing all of this, we will see what it means to be in relationship with God, fully known, fully loved, and how to then take that reality and experience it with others, living in a few relationships, not with everybody, but with a few people who fully know us and fully love us. So with all that as the setup, let's turn to 1 John chapter 1. It's at the tail end of the Bible. These are 3 very short letters. We're gonna study them verse by verse in this series for the next 7 weeks. If you were here at the beginning of the year, we started with a topical series called Body Theology. And this series is very different than that. It's kind of the old-fashioned study our way through the Bible. So if next week you wanna bring your Bible, we're gonna study it together. You'll know right where we will be. We'll pick up where we leave off today. So let's start 1 John chapter 1, verse 1. John says this, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched. This we proclaim concerning the word of life. The life appeared. We've seen it and we testify to it, and we proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and has appeared to us. We proclaim to you what we have seen and heard, so that you also may have fellowship with us. And our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. We write this to make our joy complete." Now, we could nerd out on this small section for a while, but you want to get to your Super Bowl party, so I won't. But let me just make a few observations here. And it starts with this. The themes that John is introducing us to at the beginning of the letter, well, they are very similar themes. We could say the same themes to how John starts his gospel. So the New Testament begins with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then John. And John chapter 1, the Gospel of John chapter 1 begins with some of these same themes that he begins his letter with. This helps us know who the author actually is, but it also tells us that this is crucial to John's understanding of Jesus. For example, he describes Jesus here in 1 John and John chapter 1, the gospel, as the Word. If you're kind of new to spirituality or new to Christianity or new to the Bible, that's a bit confusing. But the Greek word is logos, and in the first century, Greek thinkers saw the logos as the organizing principle behind the entire universe. Ultimate reality was found in logos, or the Word. And when John says Jesus is the Word, he's saying ultimate reality is found in him. He begins his gospel that way, and he begins his letter that way as well, which I think is just very cool to see. And then he says this, which was from the beginning, that which was from the beginning. This is incredibly important. John is saying this, Jesus has always existed. Before there was the beginning, there was him. He has always existed. I was at a dinner last week, and the dinner was interesting. Someone had a lot of questions about God, and they asked their friend, "No, I don't know if anybody can answer these questions." And the friend said, "I know somebody," and so they invited me over for dinner. And I was like, this is an awkward dinner party. And then it was amazing, okay? But one of the questions was, okay, Eric, so everything has a beginning. Well, then who began God? I said, not everything has a beginning. Things that are caused have a beginning, okay? Not everything has a beginning. See, if you are the one who authored time, if you created time, you are timeless because you existed before it. And so what John is saying here is that Jesus did not have a beginning. He was there in the beginning. He has always been. What John is saying is that Jesus is eternal. He's always existed. We don't have time today to unpack this, but Jesus talked about that. John chapter 8. What we see here is that Jesus is fully 100% God. But there's something else that John does here that's so incredible. in the first little section, he uses 4 verbs. I put a little 1, 2, 3, and a 4 by them to describe who Jesus is. Jesus is 100% fully human as well. John says we've looked upon him, we've seen him, we've heard him, we've touched him. John says this, I've lived with him. I've been eyeball to eyeball with him. And this is so important. Jesus must be fully God. To be perfect, to be sinless, to take our place, and then for that righteous record to become ours, gifted to us. And he must be fully human to be our substitute, to die in our place. If Jesus is not fully God and not fully human, salvation absolutely crumbles. So here in the first few lines of 1 John, John's getting deep theologically. And he wants his readers to be certain of this. Jesus is eternal and he is physical. Eternal and physical. Now, why does this matter? Well, there were some teachers that had visited these small communities, like I said, most likely in Asia Minor. Unlike Paul's letters, we're not told their exact locations, but we understand the region. There were some teachers who had visited, and they began teaching something that was different than this. And John needs to write to correct this. So the contour drawing exists as a stark contrast between what salvation actually is and what the false teachers were actually teaching. And so when we read John, there are some things that seem very punchy, seem very direct, and very stark. But they exist as the contour to the Gnosticism or the false teaching that existed in these communities. Gnosticism is a big word. It comes from the Greek word for knowledge. But let me tell you what this worldview or this philosophy was all about. Gnosticism was an early heretical understanding of Christianity that emphasized secret knowledge and the spiritual over the physical. 2 parts, secret knowledge, the spiritual over the physical. See, in religion now and even then, spirituality, there was this idea that you could reach higher ground, spiritual enlightenment. You could arrive, you could be so aware, and you could obtain that through some secret knowledge. Nobody else has it. Feel bad for them. But if you have it, oh, good for you, you know? And that was obtained through private ceremonies and some rituals and perhaps some handshakes and a whole bunch of other things that happened tucked away behind the scenes. But if you got there, it didn't really matter what you did with your life because you had already arrived after all. And so there was this separation, okay? Good news is that Jesus died publicly. He was raised to life publicly. Christianity is a public declaration, as we just witnessed with Leslie, a public declaration of our trust in the one whose ministry was public, okay? Now, there's a private aspect to our faith, of course, but this isn't all happening in private, tucked away. And if you have the secret knowledge, it doesn't matter what you do. That was one aspect of Gnosticism. The other aspect of Gnosticism was this: the spiritual or the immaterial was better than the physical. You could say it like this: matter doesn't matter, okay? That's how they thought. Matter doesn't matter. And so you could do whatever you wanted with your physical because your spiritual was all good. You've reached a higher plane. Live it up, you know? Put the pineapple out front and do what you want to do, okay? You guys get that joke? Sorry, don't worry. I feel like some of you are falling asleep on me. Throwing a pineapple joke, everybody wakes up. That was the idea. You could live however you wanted. Now, this is problematic in a lot of ways, but let me just say this. They were trying to separate the spiritual Christ from the physical Jesus. And by doing that, they had actually lost salvation entirely. Jesus is fully God, fully man. That had to be maintained, and they were walking away from it. So John writes to draw a contrast drawing to help us understand that Jesus is eternal and physical, okay? This is called the incarnation. They were denying the incarnation. The incarnation is the doctrine of Jesus taking on our full humanity in addition to his full deity. Now, in their defense, the reason, though, that they pushed back on this is it seemed too crude. As the young kids say, a little too basic, okay? It wasn't all that impressive. They saw the immaterial, the spiritual as good, but someone born in a manger, a king in a stable, a lowly estate, needy, after all, that couldn't be the king. That couldn't be the one who was God come to rescue or Messiah. It was far too crude. And John would say, crude perhaps, but true. I want to show you a drawing. I want to put it up here on the screen. Does anybody know who drew this? Anybody, any art majors? Do you guys know who drew this? Picasso. Well done. Picasso, you got it right. She guessed. She's like, really? This is Picasso's drawing of Igor Stravinsky. Stravinsky's famous for his musical piece, The Rite of Spring. And as you look at this, you would see a contour drawing. Very simple, there's not any shading, no color, very little detail, on purpose, by design, to draw out the beauty that simply comes from the shapes and the contour drawing. Now, you could say this is crude, is basic. Someone in first service was like, I think I could draw that. I'm like, good luck, okay? It's crude, and yet it still is very powerful. Some would say very beautiful. And John would say the incarnation could seem crude to some sensibilities, but it's absolutely true. Because after all, we've seen him, we've heard from him, we've looked at him, we've touched him, we have lived with him. You might call it crude, but if it's true, it is to be embraced. That's what John is saying as he builds this case. He has witnessed it. And what he says here a couple times, and we'll see it again, is he's talking about fellowship. That this isn't an abstract idea to think about. This is a person to walk with, fully known, fully loved. So let's continue. John continues to sketch out the outline as he goes on, picking it up now in verse 5. This is the message we have heard from him and we declare to you, and here's a big declaration, God is light. God is light. So here comes more contrast between light and dark, okay? God is light. In him there is no darkness at all. If we claim to have fellowship with him and yet walk in the darkness, well, we lie and do not live out the truth. So another strong contrast. This whole book is based around these very stark contrasts to make incredibly powerful points, okay? But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, his son, purifies us from all sin. There's the word again, fellowship. He's getting at fully known, fully loved in your relationship with God. If you've heard people talk about, do you have a personal relationship with God? That can be a little bit confusing. In fact, I was driving middle schoolers home from youth group last week, and one of them said, hey, Eric, can we turn down Justin Bieber for a second? I have a question for you. I'm like, happily. And they were like, how do you know? How do you know that you have a relationship with God? I don't have time to break that down in this message, but it was a beautiful question. And it's a rather simple answer. Fully known, fully loved. Do you approach him that way? That is relational at its core. Arthur and Norma in the short story missed that. Now, real quick, when it comes to reading the Bible, this chapter is a little harder than you might think, and I'll take you into some of the tension if we have time. But one thing I do want you to see is whenever the Bible uses repetition, it's a big clue to the context. And so here he's using fellowship over and over again. We've read it just 4 times already. It's clear that he is talking about walking with God. Fellowship with God, sanctification, not how to be justified. We'll come back to this in a moment. If we claim to be without sin, verse 8 now, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. If we confess our sins, he's faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. He's making these if-then claims. If we say this, but this, we have a problem. If we say this, but this, there's another problem. And he's saying people in these communities were saying this about themselves, not seeing the problem. Basically, because I've arrived on this higher plane, Gnosticism, it doesn't really matter what I do. And John is trying to correct that, okay? Verse 10, if we claim we have not sinned, we make him out to be a liar and his word is not in us. Very strong language, but once again, this contrast is meant to be strong. So, pause right there. And let's unpack this a little bit further. What does it mean to walk with God? What is John actually describing? Walking in the light, walking with God. One of the reasons this passage is tricky is for many of us, especially inside of evangelicalism, we've spent a lot of time with the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans talking about justification. What makes me right before God once and forever, okay? This is very, very important. Paul talks about justification, but we read this from John and we think, wait a second, is he saying I have to confess like all the time because that's at risk or that's going away. And if we try to get John to read like Paul, we're going to get into some troubling waters, some confusing waters, like very, very quickly, okay? Let me explain two extremes and then explain what John is actually doing. One extreme is this. For people to say, you know what, because I'm so right about justification, I'm so right about theology, it doesn't matter really how I live because I'm so good with God, I'm right with him forever, so I'll stand right here. And you are right with God forever the moment you trust him. That doesn't mean how you live does not matter. What I call this is evangelical Gnosticism. I'm so right about justification, I'm so right about Romans that I can live however I want. I'm in. It's not going to change. And also, I don't want to really change either. I'm not going to look at my life. That is license, okay? That's thinking I have this card that just says saved and I'm going to live however I want. Now, if we take John and we try to put it over Paul, it gets very confusing because he's talking about ongoing confession, ongoing purification, ongoing perhaps unrighteousness, and ongoing forgiveness. Justification is here. Paul describes it clearly, and we're going to see John knows it clearly too as chapter 2 opens. But what John is trying to say is we do need to examine our life and bring the things in our life before God and bring them into his light so that we can continue to walk with him. So if one extreme is license, the other extreme, though, is in the category of religion, which says you can't be certain you're saved, so you better every moment be confessing. And by the way, if you die suddenly and you didn't confess, I guess you're not saved because you had one of those sins that didn't get forgiven before you kick the bucket, you know? That's not what John is describing. You can have security, justified forever in, and nothing's gonna change that, right with God. And yet because of that, bring all the things that you're tempted to hide into the light, acknowledge them before him, and experience being fully known and fully loved. This is what John is describing. Let me illustrate it to you like a marriage. I remember in the early years of my marriage, I was so selfish, you guys. One time I came home from a round of golf. Carissa was at home with a little baby, Nora, I think, and our daughter, and I was like, babe, you should have seen my drive on 14. I crushed it. It was right, and I wedged it. I made the putt. You should have seen the putt I made on 16. I was so excited about my golf round, and Carissa said, this wasn't the first golf round of the week. She said to me, when will you be as excited about our relationship as you are about your golf? And I was like, oh boy. Some of you are nodding. Maybe you've heard something similar. Oh my goodness. There's been many times where this has happened, and I had to say, oh my gosh, sweetie, I am so sorry. You're right. I'm so sorry. Listen, in those moments, the marriage covenant wasn't at risk. I knew we were married. That wasn't going to change. But our fellowship, our connection, our closeness, our intimacy, well, that was at risk, wasn't it? Both are true. Paul talks about justification a lot. John talks about sanctification here because he's so worried that people would think I have special knowledge, I believe so accurately, it doesn't matter how I live. And he's saying if you live that way, it's as if you're living in darkness. You've missed it. That's what he is describing. We could say it like this: to walk in the light is to acknowledge our sin. To walk in the dark is to deny it. To walk in the light is to acknowledge our sin. To walk in the dark is to deny it. This is so helpful because the moment you hear walking in the light, if you grew up in religion, you think I knew it. It's like getting my life together and cleaning up the mess and getting more worthy and being more perfect. That's not what he's describing as walking in the light. To him, to John, what he wants us to see as walking in the light is saying, God, here I am before you and I am a mess. God, here I am before you and I am unworthy. God, here I am before you standing in your light. I am not perfect. God, I need you. Denying that we have sin only keeps us in the dark and it denies the truth. John is making that point. But because God is so good and so gracious, we can take the things that we're tempted to hide, especially if you grew up in religion. It's like stuff those aside. Don't let anybody see. And the gospel is bring them into God's light and allow them to be covered by the love and grace of Jesus. And that acceptance alone, the opposite of shame, will transform you. This is what John is describing. So to walk in the light is to acknowledge our sin. To walk in the darkness is to deny it, which is really, really helpful. But it's hard to bow the knee. So what we're talking about here is confession. This is what John is describing. He's used that word. Here's a simple definition of confession. It's our acknowledgement of the worst parts of ourselves before God. Acknowledgement of the worst parts of ourselves before God. Now, what we're getting at here is to be in relationship with him. To take those parts of our lives that dishonor him and dishonor others, those things that are driven by ego and selfishness and idolatry, our affections for anything else except God, and to say, God, here they are. Can I lay them before you? God, I've trampled your love. I've undermined your goodness. I've assumed I know better. God, I know that I've stepped across the line to trust you. That's actually why I'm here before you, dumping out this stuff to you. Would you forgive me for it again and again and again and again so that I can walk in your light? Now, if you grew up in religion or you grew up with some ideas about what it means to fear the Lord that were maybe incorrect, this is the scariest thing imaginable. Because you might think, if I shared that with God, man, wouldn't he get me? He already knows because he is light after all. He fully knows us and he still fully loves us. This is how magnificent God is. And so we are free to confess. Now, when I say confess, depending on your religious background, you might have an idea of having to walk to something or go through some hoops and confess to someone, and then that someone who's the authority can say, you're good to go now. That's not how the Bible teaches confession. Jesus is our high priest. We go straight to him, and he can offer us forgiveness. So then we are safe to confess. And because our salvation is secure, we are safe to bring these things before him, knowing we won't be condemned or shamed by him because of them. And this is how we live in the light. This is how we walk in fellowship with our God, taking things in our lives that we'd like to keep in the dark, things that maybe we are blind to, but as he shows us them in our life through his light, we bring them to him and we acknowledge them. And then what? Well, let's peek into chapter 2 and we'll be done. My dear children, I write this to you so that you will not sin. But if anybody does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous one. John gets it. John knows substitutionary atonement. He knows that Jesus is our advocate. He knows about imputed righteousness, all these terms that we think of when we study Paul. But John knows them too. So John gets justification. He also gets sanctification. He wants us to experience our salvation, stepping across the line to trust and then being fully known and fully loved. He's the atoning sacrifice for our sins, not only for ours, but also for the sins of the whole world. So the invitation of today's message is very, very simple. Would you, in the next few moments that we have together, take anything that you have, anything that you've been hiding, anything that you've been fearful of acknowledging before God, and take it to him. Because he sees it already. And as you do, you will experience his love all the more. Because now that you've confessed, you're only more fully known and therefore appreciative of how fully loved you actually are. So the bottom line of our message is this today. Jesus gave his body and blood for us so that we could be fully known and fully loved. So I'm going to invite some of our volunteers on the team forward. They're going to begin at the front. They're going to start to pass around some trays. And in the trays, there are 2 cups. And I'll give you some instruction and then I'll explain. In the tray, there are 2 cups stacked on each other. In the second cup, there's the bread. So when you get it, you want to separate them. You'll hold the bread and you'll hold the juice. Jesus, who is eternal and physical, on the night he was betrayed, gave us another symbol. We've celebrated one symbol today through baptism, but we're going to celebrate another. Symbols are not the substance of the thing, but they're a fitting symbol of the thing, the meaningful thing. And Jesus said, "This is my body broken for you." And he said to symbolize it with bread. And then he took the cup and said, "This is my blood poured out for you." And he symbolized it with juice. And he told us that when we gather, we can remember his death in this way. So by eating and drinking the bread and the juice, we are symbolically saying, Jesus, I receive your work on the cross into my life. I want to celebrate it. I want to come before you. I want to celebrate your sacrifice. And there's one really important thing we get to do today first, though. And that is we get to confess before we receive. So we're going to sing another song, and then we're going to sing. But before we get there, I want you to just take a moment and maybe acknowledge something in your life before Jesus that maybe you haven't acknowledged before. And then as you acknowledge that, as you confess that, it's a wonderful moment for you to receive those two elements. So you can do that on your own, but I want to invite you first to pause in a moment of confession and then receive communion.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's message and trusting us with your time. If you'd like to connect with one of our pastors or staff, you can easily do that by visiting smccutah.org/connect. When you fill out that quick form, they will get back to you within a few days and be able to connect with you. As well, if you'd like to know more about taking a next step at SMCC, you can easily look at what next steps we have by visiting smccutah.org/next steps. And lastly, if you found today's message both hopeful and helpful, I would encourage you to do maybe one of two things. First, you can share this message with someone that would find it helpful. And you can also choose to partner with us financially so that more people can see messages like this. You can find more information on what that looks like by visiting smccutah.org/give. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I hope to see you at one of our locations soon.